On the 29th of September, 1974, a little before 2 in the morning, a park ranger named Grady Coker walked west off a gravel track into the open salt of Death Valley to check on a set of headlights that were not there, friends, and he left behind him a line of boot prints in the soft crust that ran 400 yards out onto the flat, dead straight, unhurried, and then stopped, not turned, not scuffed, not sunk into a soft spot or lost on hard ground. Stopped, friends, mid-stride. In the middle of a salt pan, you could see a mile across by starlight, with nothing on it, nothing above it, and nothing under it, but more salt. And around that last print, the crust lay smooth and unbroken and white, in every direction for as far as our lamps would throw. And Grady Coker was not at the end of his own tracks, friends, and he was not anywhere. And the weather sheet from the airfield at Furnace Creek says there was no wind that night, not a breath, from dusk to dawn. I was the man holding the radio when he went, friends. He told me to stay with the truck. That is the last order Grady Coker ever gave me, and I kept it. And I have spent 50 years wondering whether keeping it makes me the man who obeyed or the man who let him walk out there alone, and I still do not know. And tonight, at last, I am going to lay the whole of it out under this lamp, the part the report explained, which is most of it. Friends, heat and dark, and a trick of the desert air that has fooled better men than us since before there were men to fool, and the one part it never could, which is where a set of boot prints go when they simply, in the middle of a flat white nothing, on a windless night, run out. Pull your chair in close to the lamp, friends, and before we walk out onto that salt together, do an old ranger one kindness. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, and whether the country around you holds the heat or the cold tonight. I like to know what weather sits with us. And if you want the rest of the records this channel keeps, the button costs you nothing, and it keeps this old light burning. Now, Death Valley, the autumn of '74, and the emptiest beat a man ever walked. My name is Boone Hatley, and in the fall of 1974 I was 26 years old, and I was a park ranger in Death Valley, which in those days was not yet a national park, but a national monument, the largest one in the country. Friends, and I want to spend a minute on the place before I spend the rest of the night on the man, because in this account, as in the one I know some of you have heard me tell before about the high country, the place is not the stage. The place is the thing that reaches out. Death Valley is a hole in the earth, friends. That is the simplest true thing I can tell you about it. The floor of it lies below the level of the sea, the lowest dry ground on this continent, a trough near 140 miles long, walled in by burned mountains, and down the belly of it runs the salt, the great white pan they call the flats, thousands of acres of it, the dried bed of a lake that died before the pyramids, cracked into a crust. You can walk on in most places, and break through into black stinking mud in others. Flat, friends, flatter than any water, flat the way a thing is, flat that the world has pressed all the life and all the shape and all the mercy out of. In the summer, the ground reads 180 degrees in the sun, and the air reads 120 in the shade, if you can find shade, and it kills people. Friends, it kills them every single year, and it kills them so reliably and so explainably, of heat, of thirst, of a wrong turn on a dirt road with a bad radiator, that the deaths make a kind of grim arithmetic a monument can carry, and the rangers learn to carry it. What the monument could not carry, friends, what I have carried instead for 50 years, is the death that made no arithmetic at all. There were maybe a dozen of us rangers spread over an area the size of a small state. Friends and we ran the campgrounds and the paved loops and the springs where the tourists gathered. But the real work, the work I loved, was the back country, the dirt tracks out to the old borax works and the played-out mines and the lonely wells. And the man who taught me that work was Grady Coker. Grady was 34 that autumn. Friends, a lean, sun-cured, slow-talking man out of the Owens Valley who had rangered the desert parks for a dozen years and knew Death Valley the way you know the inside of your own mouth, without looking, without thinking, and he was the best I ever saw at the one thing the desert most demands, which is patience. Grady did not hurry in that country, friends. He used to tell me the desert kills the hasty first, and he was right. And it is the bitterest thing in this whole account that the desert took the least hasty man I ever knew. He had a wife, Iris, in the little government housing at Furnace Creek, and no children. And he had one lesson he gave me, more often than any other, more often even than the ones about water. And I wrote it down at the time, the way a young man writes down an old man's saying, half to honor it and half to humor it. And it is the hinge this whole night turns on. Friends, so I will give it to you now, in Grady Coker's own flat. Patient words, the way he said it to me a dozen times across a truck seat in the dark. Boone, he said. Out here at night, light does not sit where it says it sits. The air lies to you about how far and how big. And if you are ever out on the flats after dark, and you see a light, and you start toward it, and it keeps the same distance from you, no matter how far you walk, you stop, son. You stop right there, and you sit down, and you wait for the sun. Because that is not a light that wants finding. That is the desert holding a lantern, Boone, and it has all night, and you do not. The night it happened began with a different missing pair, friends, and I have to give you them first. Because Grady did not walk out onto that salt for no reason. He walked out onto it for the best reason a good man ever has, which is to help somebody. And that is the cruelty at the center of this account. The same cruelty I have found at the center of more of these than I care to count. 3 days before, a couple named Guy and Vada Cathcart, retired people out of Bakersfield in a new Ford, had driven into the monument to see the borax ruins and had not driven out. Their car turned up on the second day, friends, off a spur track on the far west side of the flats, out toward Rycroft Well, doors shut, low on gas, a cooler of thawed food in the back, and no Cathcarts, and we had been searching that whole side of the valley for them for 2 days in the heat with no sign. And every ranger in the monument had the Cathcarts on his mind the way you carry the missing, friends, like a stone that gets heavier after dark. So that is the frame you must hold. When Grady Coker saw headlights out on the Ashen Flat at 2 in the morning, friends, where he knew for a fact there was no road, his first thought was not a strange thought. It was the kindest, most natural thought a searching man could have. He thought he had found the Cathcart's car. We were parked that night on the gravel track that runs along the east edge of the Ashen Flat. Friends Grady and I, working the last leg of a long shift, headlights off, letting our eyes have the stars, which out there, with no town within 70 miles, are a thing the flatland people cannot imagine. A sky so heavy with them, it throws a shadow. And Grady, in the driver's seat, went still in the way a hunting dog goes still and said, Boone, look west. And I looked west, friends. Out across the pale sheet of the salt, and there they were. Headlights. 2 of them. Low and yellow and steady. Out on the flat, maybe half a mile off by my eye. The unmistakable paired glow of a stopped car with its lamps on, sitting where the Cathcart's Ford would sit if the Cathcarts had driven it out onto the pan and gotten stuck. And my heart went up, friends, because after 2 days of nothing, there they were. Grady got on the radio to Furnace Creek and raised the night dispatcher, a steady woman named Nadine Poe, who I will have more to say about. And he reported it, calm as ever. Furnace Creek, Coker. I have headlights on the Ashen Flat, bearing about west from the Rycroft track, half a mile out. Could be the Cathcart vehicle. Going to walk out for a look, and Nadine's voice came back and told him to wait for a second unit. And Grady looked at me. Friends, and he said, the thing that has never stopped being the worst small ordinary sentence I ever heard. Those people have been out here 3 days, Boone. I am not waiting an hour on a walk I can do in 20 minutes. Stay with the truck and keep me on the radio. And he took a canteen and a flashlight, friends, and he stepped off the gravel and out onto the salt, walking west toward the lights, and I stood by the open door of the truck, with the radio in my hand, and watched him go. His flashlight a little bobbing spark, getting smaller against that enormous dark, and for the first few minutes it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Friends, a ranger walking out to a stuck car, and I could hear his boots on the crust when the desert was quiet enough, that soft crunch, crunch, and I could see, past him, the yellow headlights, sitting, waiting. And then, friends, somewhere around the 5-minute mark, Grady's voice came up on the radio, and it was not alarmed. I want to be plain about that. It was puzzled. The voice of a man checking his own arithmetic, the way I have heard other men on other nights, and he said, Boone, these lights, I have been walking a good while and they are not getting any closer. I looked at my watch. Friends, he had been walking maybe 7 minutes, which on that flat is most of a half mile, and the lights should have been right on top of him. And I looked out at them and looked at his little spark of a flashlight, and, friends, he was right. The gap between Grady's flashlight and those yellow headlights had not closed at all. If anything, and I have never been able to decide if this was true or if the dark was working on me, if anything, the gap looked wider. And I keyed the radio. And I said, Grady, come on back. And there was a pause. Friends, a long one. And then his voice quieter, and the puzzled had gone out of it, and something else had come in, something I had never once heard in that flat patient man in 2 years, and he said, Boone, they keep the same distance. No matter how I walk, they keep the exact same distance. And I stood there on the gravel, friends, with every hair on my arm standing up in the 90-degree dark, because I had heard those words before. I had heard them across a truck seat a dozen times. You see a light, and you start toward it, and it keeps the same distance from you no matter how far you walk. And I keyed the radio to tell him, to say it back to him, his own lesson, stop, sit down, wait for the sun. And before I could get the words out, friends, Grady Coker's voice came up one more time, and it was almost wondering, almost soft, the voice of a man who has just understood something and is not yet afraid. And he said, Boone, that is strange. The lights are below me now. And the radio hissed, friends, open and empty. And then it closed, and Grady Coker never said another word to me, or to Nadine Poe, or to any living soul, from that second to this one. I did the wrong thing first, friends, and I will not hide it from you, because a young man's panic is part of this record too. When the radio closed, I did not sit and wait and keep my head. I ran. I ran out onto that salt after him, with my own flashlight, west, toward where his spark had been, calling his name. And I want to tell you what stopped me, friends, about 200 yards out, breathing like a bellows. because it is the first hard fact of this account, and I have never gotten around it. The lights were gone. The yellow headlights that Grady and I had both watched for 15 minutes, steady as a porch lamp, were simply not there anymore, and there was no car pulling away, no glow dropping behind a rise, because there is no rise out there. Friend, the flat is flat. A car with its lights on is visible for miles, and one moment they were there, and the next my eye had nothing to hold, and I stood in the middle of the Ashen Flat at 2 in the morning with my heart trying to climb out of my throat, and I understood in my body before my mind would say it, that I was standing in a place where the ordinary rules of light and distance had quietly stopped applying. And I did the one wise thing I did that whole night, friends. I remembered Grady's rule. I stopped. I didn't go on into that dark, chasing a thing that wanted chasing. I backed up, friends, keeping my own truck's shape against the stars behind me so I would not lose it. And I got to the gravel, and I got on the radio, and I called in every unit and every soul the monument had. They came fast, friends, give the service that. And by first light, there were rangers and county deputies and a search plane out of the airfield, and by noon, near 40 people, working the Ashen Flat. And the flat, friends in daylight, gave us exactly one thing, and it is the thing this whole account exists to set down, and I was there when the tracker found it. An old Shoshone man named Willie Bolin the county used for this work, the best I ever saw. Grady's tracks. They came off the gravel where he had stepped onto the salt, plain as print in the soft crust, the waffle of his ranger boots, and they ran west, friends, out onto the pan, dead straight toward where the lights had been. One clean, confident stride after another. No stagger, no wander. The walk of a sober, competent man, crossing flat ground in the dark. And Willie Bolin followed them, and we followed Willie, and they ran. Friends, 400 and some yards out onto the middle of the Ashen Flat, out where there was nothing, nothing at all. No car, no track of any car, never any track of any car. Friends, remember that. Whatever made those headlights left no wheel in that crust, and Grady's boot prints ran out to a spot as bare and flat and open as a tabletop. And there, friends, they stopped. Willie Bolin got down on his knees over the last two prints, the left and then the right. Both of them clean, both of them full-weighted. The print of a man in mid-stride, in the act of taking the next step. And there was no next step. Ahead of that last right boot print, friends, the crust of the Ashen Flat lay smooth, unbroken, untouched, white, in every direction, for hundreds of yards, out to where the mountains stood up black against the dawn, and Grady Coker was not on it. Willie Bolin knelt there a long time, friends, and then he stood up, and he took off his hat, which I did not understand until later, and he said to the sheriff, in a voice with no argument left in it, "He does not walk out of here, mister. He walks to here." And he stops, and he did not fall, and he did not sink, and he did not turn. And then the old man looked west, out across all that empty morning salt, the way you look at a person, friends, not the way you look at a place. And he put his hat back on, and he walked back toward the trucks, and he would not work that flat again. Not that day, not any day. And no amount of county money ever changed his mind. They brought a dog out, friends. The second day, a good air-scent search dog, off a handler from the county, a shepherd bitch that had found more than one lost soul in that country. And I want to tell you about the dog, because the dog is the piece the flatland people always lean toward. And I understand why. She took Grady's scent easy off his jacket in the truck, Friends, glad and businesslike the way a good dog is. And her handler walked her out along the line of prints, and she followed it, nose down and then nose up, working, sure of herself, 400 yards out onto the pan, straight and eager, right out to the end of the tracks. And, at the end of the tracks, friends, at that last full-weighted right boot print, with nothing after it, the dog stopped. And she did not cast around the way a dog does, when it has lost a scent, friends, nosing left and right, circling, trying to pick the thread back up. She sat down. She sat down at the end of Grady Coker's tracks, and she pointed her nose west, out across the empty morning salt, and she held it there. Friends, ears up. Still, the way a dog holds on a thing it can see, on a man standing in plain view that no one else can make out, and she would not go forward, and she would not cast, and she made, her handler told the sheriff, a sound low in her chest that he had never heard her make in 6 years of this work, and after a while she got up and backed away from that spot. Backed, friends, not turned, keeping her face to the west, and lay down against her handler's legs, and would not work any more that day. And I know what the plain answer is, friends. I have said it to myself 1,000 times. The heat. By mid-morning, that salt was already an oven, and heat destroys scent, boils it right off the ground, and a scent trail that simply ends in the heat will stop a dog cold. That is real, friends, and it is probably the answer, and it explains why she would not go forward. It does not, friends, and I have turned this for 50 years. It does not explain why she sat and pointed. A dog that has lost a scent looks confused. A dog that has found one looks certain. That dog, friends, at the end of Grady's tracks, looked certain. And what she was certain of was out there, to the west, on the empty flat, where there was nothing at all for a human eye to hold. Now I owe you the plain explanations, friends, because they are real, and because I have leaned on them for 50 years the way a man leans on a rail over a long drop. And I want you to have the same rail, before I tell you why. It does not quite hold. The lights first. There is a thing the desert does at night that is as real as sunrise. Friends, and every ranger, and pilot, and old prospector in that country knows it, and it is called an inversion, and this is the shape of it. The salt flat soaks up the furnace heat all day and throws it back after dark, and that warm air lies in a layer over the pan with cooler air above it, and light passing between those layers bends. Friends, it refracts. The way a straw looks broken in a glass of water, and a light that is real but far away. A miner's lamp, a distant truck on a road 40 miles off. A star sitting low on the horizon can be lifted and doubled and stood up out on the flat where it is not, made to look near and low and paired like headlights, and made, as the layers shift with the cooling of the night, to seem to hold its distance, or to sink, or to wink out all at once when the air settles. That is real, friends. I have seen it a dozen times since, and every time my stomach drops. The headlights Grady walked toward were almost certainly a mirage, a real light from somewhere far off, bent and lifted by the desert air into a lie that looked exactly like the stuck car of 2 people we were aching to find. I believe that, friends. I have to believe that, and I mostly do. And it explains the lights, and it explains why they kept their distance, and it explains why they vanished when I ran out under them and the air stirred. It explains everything about that night, friends, everything, except the one thing I was standing right on top of at dawn with my hat in my hand. It does not explain the tracks. A mirage does not take a man off the middle of a salt flat. Grady Coker did not walk into a bent ray of light. He walked, on his own 2 feet, to a spot on the open pan, and his own boots printed him getting there. And then the man who made those prints was gone, off the flat, off the earth. Friends, with 400 yards of his own tracks behind him, and not 1 inch of anything ahead, on a night the airfield swears had no wind to sweep a footprint smooth. And that, friends, that last right boot print with nothing after it, is the thing I have carried for 50 years, and I am going to tell you every way I have tried to fill it, and how each one failed, before I tell you the 2 words the weather sheet took away. The first thing I tried to fill it with, friends, in the days right after, was wind. It is the natural answer, the only natural answer, and every man on that search reached for it. A footprint in soft salt crust is a fragile thing, and a desert wind carries grit, and a good blow could scour a set of tracks smooth in an hour. And if the wind had come up after Grady walked out, it could have swept the salt ahead of his last print clean, while somehow, and here the answer already starts to limp, friends, somehow leaving the 400 yards behind him untouched. But I did not have to argue myself out of the wind, friends, because the monument argued it out for me on paper. And this is the piece of this account. You could go and check yourself if the paper still existed, which it does not, and I will come to that. Death Valley had a weather station at the Furnace Creek airfield. Friends, a good one. Government instruments read and logged every hour of every day and night, wind speed and direction among them, because in that country, the wind is a matter of life and death, and the pilots needed it. And the log for the night of the 29th of September, 1974, the sheet I held in my own hands 3 days later, when I went looking for my rail to lean on, read calm. Friends, calm at midnight, calm at 1, calm at 2, the hour Grady walked, calm at 3, calm at 4, calm at the dawn when we found the tracks. Wind speed 0, friends, hour after hour, a dead still night. The kind of breathless desert stillness where a candle would not gutter. And I stood in the little airfield office holding that sheet, and I felt the rail I was leaning on come away from the wall in my hands because there was no wind. Friends, there was no wind to sweep those tracks, and the crust ahead of Grady's last step was not scoured smooth. The searchers all said so, and Willie Bolin staked his name on it. It was undisturbed. It was old. It was crust that had lain untouched for weeks, and a man cannot walk out onto weeks-old undisturbed salt, leave 400 yards of print, and then leave no print at all, not by any working of wind or weather that I have learned in 50 years of the desert. So I tried the ground, friends. If not the wind, then a soft spot, a place where the crust was thin over the black mud beneath, and Grady had broken through and gone down into the mud, and the crust had closed or been packed over him. It happens, friends. The flats have places like that, and men and animals have been caught in them. But you do not go down into salt mud silently and completely and leave the surface smooth as a plate, friends. A man breaking through struggles. He throws his arms. He breaks more crust. He leaves a wound in the ground the size of a grave. And the searchers probed that whole area, friends, yard by yard, with rods, for days, looking for exactly that soft spot. And the ground under Grady's last print, and for 100 yards around it, was hard, friends, sun-baked hard, salt over hardpan, a surface you could have driven a truck across. And there was no hole, and there was no fill, and there was no grave, and there was no Grady, and I ran out of ground the way I had run out of wind. And I tried, friends. God forgive me, I tried the ugliest answer, the one a man tries at 3 in the morning when the others have failed, which is that there was no mystery, that Grady Coker walked out onto that flat and kept walking, right off the end of his own printed tracks and onto ground that for some reason took no print, hardpan, wind-glazed salt, and just kept going, west, into the mountains, and left us, left Iris, walked out of his life the way men sometimes do. And I chased that one the hardest, friends, because it was the only answer with no strangeness in it, and it fell the hardest, because the tracks did not lead to a patch of hard ground and continue invisibly, friends. Willie Boland was certain, the sheriff was certain, I saw it with my own eyes. The tracks led to soft, printable, undisturbed crust, the same crust ahead as behind, crust that took Grady's weight and held it beautifully, that recorded 400 yards of him in perfect waffled detail. And on that same soft holding crust, in mid-stride, they stopped, with hundreds of yards of identical print-holding salt stretching away empty in front of them. He did not reach hard ground and walk on. He reached on soft ground that was recording his every step, the end of himself. And there is no answer for that in wind or mud or a wandering heart, friends, and I have looked for one for 50 years, and the looking is most of what my life has been. Now let me tell you what the monument did with it, friends, because it is quieter than the other accounts at this lamp. And the quiet is its own kind of answer. There was no gray sedan, friends. There were no men in suits. There was only a good, tired, decent chief ranger named Cy Redfield, who ran a search until searching was pointless, and then ran an inquiry, until the inquiry had a paper to close on. And the paper it closed on said heat exposure and disorientation. Probable. Remains not recovered. And Cy Redfield knew that was a coat 2 sizes too small for what happened out there, friends. And he put it on the monument anyway, because it was the only coat the government made. And I do not damn him for it. What was he to write? That a ranger walked to the middle of a salt flat, following a light that was not there, and stepped off the surface of the earth on a windless night. You cannot file that, friends. It does not go in the box. So heat exposure it was, and the Ashen Flat and the Rycroft track were quietly closed to patrol that winter. Friends, a gate put across the spur, a line drawn on the ranger maps, hazard, terrain, no reason a tourist would ever question. And the weather sheet, friends, the one true document, the hourly log that said, calm, 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 through the whole of that night, and turned the wind answer to ash. That sheet went into the incident file with everything else. And when I went back years later, a grown man with rank of my own, to hold it one more time and be sure I had not dreamed a dead still night, the incident file was thin, friends, and the weather log for the 29th of September was not in it. Signed out for archival transfer in a hand I did not know and never signed back, the way these things go, friends. Not stolen, not by villains, just quietly gone in the ordinary friction of an institution that has no drawer for a windless night that swallowed a man. But I had copied it, friends, years before, the way a man copies the one thing that proves he is not mad. And the Cathcarts, friends, Guy and Vada, the couple whose lights Grady thought he saw, they were found that same week, 4 miles south, in the shade of a borax ruin, where they had walked trying to find help when their car quit, dead of the heat, together, an ordinary desert tragedy, with an ordinary desert answer, and they had never once been out on the Ashen Flat. Friends, and their car, when it was towed, had a dead battery, and had not had working headlights for the 2 days before Grady ever saw a light on that salt at all. Now let me close the accounts, friends, name by name, because the years are the part no report can seal, and then I will give you the rule. And then I will let you go home to your own lit doors. Cy Redfield, the Chief Ranger, who signed the coat 2 sizes too small, transferred out of the desert parks within the year, friends, to a green place, a forest in the north, and a man who served with him there told me that Cy Redfield, who had spent 20 years in country where you can see 50 miles, spent the rest of his career in country where you cannot see past the next tree, and never once complained about the rain. And I understand that, friends, the way I understand a man choosing flat ground after a mountain took someone. There are those who, after the desert shows them the one thing, want never again to be able to see a light coming from a long way off in the dark. Nadine Poe, the night dispatcher who logged Grady's last 3 transmissions, kept the tape, friends, the actual reel of that radio traffic. When the written log went the way of the weather sheet, and she gave it to me before she died. And I have listened to it more times than is good for a man. And I will tell you, the only thing on it that the transcript never captured. Because a transcript records words and not the space around them. Between Grady saying they keep the same distance and Grady saying the lights are below me now, there is a gap of about 40 seconds, friends, of open radio, of Grady's carrier keyed and live. And in that 40 seconds, you can hear his boots, faint on the crust, still walking. Crunch, crunch, steady. And then, friends, in the last few seconds before he speaks that final time, you cannot hear them anymore. The boots stop, and there is a stretch of open air, 3, maybe 4 seconds, of no footsteps at all, of a live microphone and a silent man. And it is in that silence, friends, in that little pocket of no sound, that I have come to believe Grady Coker was already somewhere the rest of us have no word for. And then his voice comes, easy, wondering. The lights are below me now. A man remarking on a view. Friends. And then the carrier drops. And that is all. That is the whole of the last of him. 40 seconds of walking, and 4 seconds of a silence I have never once been able to fill. Iris Coker, friends, Grady's wife. She stayed in the desert, which surprised everyone, and she never remarried, and for many years, on the 29th of September, she would drive out to the gate on the Rye Croft Spur, the one the monument put up, and she would sit in her car, and she would not go past it, and once, only once, years on, she asked me the only question she ever asked me about that night, and it was not, where did he go, friends? She was too wise for that question. She asked me, Boone, do you think he knew at the end that they weren't the Cathcarts? And I told her the truth, friends, which is that I did not think he ever knew. That I thought Grady Coker walked out onto that salt believing right up to the last that he was going to help 2 frightened old people, and that whatever the desert used to draw him, it used the best thing in him to do it. His kindness, his patience, his unwillingness to make 2 lost souls wait 1 hour more. And Iris Coker nodded at that, friends, and looked out at the flats a long while and said, well, that would be like him. And I never saw her cry, friends, not once in all the years, and I have come to think that some griefs are too big for the body to do anything with, but carry, dry-eyed, out to a gate once a year and back. And the lights, friends. I have to tell you about the lights because Grady's was not the last time. I stayed in the desert parks another 30 years, and I made it my quiet business to know, and I will tell you, that the Ashen Flat has gone on showing a light, friends, on and off, across all those years, always in the same stretch of the season, the tail end of September, when the days are still furnace hot and the nights first begin to cool, and the inversion lies heaviest on the pan. Not every year, but enough. A ranger on a night patrol who radios in headlights out on the flat, where there is no road, and goes cold when the dispatcher tells him there is no unit out there. A pair of tourists at the campground who come to the desk in the morning, sheepish, asking who was driving way out on the salt with their lights on last night, because it kept them up watching it, and it never moved, and it was gone by dawn. I have a folder of them, friends, in my own hand, 30 years of them, and every single one has the same shape, a steady paired yellow light, out on the Ashen Flat, holding its distance, and every single one, friends, I want to be honest, every single one is also perfectly explained by the inversion, by a real far-off light bent and lifted onto the pan, the same trick that fooled Grady and me. And I have never once, in 30 years of collecting them, had a report of anyone foolish enough to walk out toward one. Because after Grady Coker, no ranger in Death Valley ever needed to be told twice. So I cannot tell you the light is anything but a mirage, friends. I have no track for the light. I only have a track for the man. But I will tell you that I stopped some years ago, being able to look at a steady light out in a big dark and feel nothing. And if that is all the desert left me, friends, a healthy fear of a lantern that will not come closer, then I got off cheaper than my friend did. And old Tuck Dulano, friends, the borax man, 80 years old that autumn, who had prospected those flats since before the monument existed, and who told me, when I went to him after, hunting for anyone who had ever heard of such a thing, that the Shoshone had a name for the Ashen Flat and would not camp on it, and that the borax teamsters, hard godless men who feared nothing that paid wages, would not cross it after dark, but went the long way round. And when I asked him why, friends, old Tuck Dulano looked at me with eyes gone milky with cataracts and desert light, and he said, "Son, out here, the light comes to you. In green country you go to the light. Out here it comes to you, and it is patient, and it is not a light you want to be found by." And then he told me the thing I have ended every telling of this account with for 50 years, and will end this one, friends, because it is the rule, and it cost Grady Coker everything to prove it true. There is only one law for a man alone on the flats at night, friends, and here it is. If you see a light out on the salt, and you start toward it, and it will not come closer, that light is not a thing that is lost. You are. And the only move you have, friends, the only one, is the hardest move there is, which is to do nothing. Sit down where you stand, put the light at your back if you can bear to, and wait for the sun, however long it takes, however sure you become that just a little farther, just over there, is a stuck car with 2 grateful people in it, or your own truck, or your own front door. It is none of those things, friends. It is the desert holding a lantern, and it has all night, and you do not, and the one and only way to win is to refuse to walk. Grady Coker knew that rule, friends. He taught it to me. And on the one night it was his own life on the table, the desert did not tempt him with a light for himself. It tempted him with a light for somebody else. And that, friends, is the last true thing I know about the finest man I ever served with, and about the country that took him. It knew he would not walk across that flat to save his own life. So it made him think he was walking to save somebody else's. Keep your lamps trimmed, friends, and keep them close. And if you are ever out in a big dark and a light will not come to you, you stay where you are and you let it burn. Say his name once tonight, softly. Grady Coker. He walked out to help. He always did. "Good night, friends."